And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For every one that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Now here in Luke 18, Jesus is painting a picture. There's basically two characters in the story that Jesus is talking about. The first one is a Pharisee. Now, in order to understand the story better, you have to understand who these people are and what they represent. A Pharisee is one of the three groups of Jews who were living at the time that Jesus was upon this earth. The Pharisees were Jews who followed very meticulously all the Jewish laws. They didn't want to miss any of them. They wanted to make sure that they followed all the dietary laws of Moses and all the laws that were found in the first 5 books of the Bible, in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they followed the Mosaic laws of purity. These were good people, but they were enemies of Jesus Christ. They tried to discredit Jesus Christ because they were following all of the Jewish law, and they saw the different things that Jesus did, and they didn't like him. Probably the group that gave Jesus the most trouble while he was on this earth were the religious Jewish people. You know, you would think that would be different. You think it would be the crowd that doesn't believe in God. You would think it would be the crowd that doesn't care anything about God. But the truth of the matter is, when Jesus walked on this earth, the crowd that gave him the most trouble were these religious Jews, the Pharisees. But they were upright, and they were moral, and they were meticulous in rules. They would not eat anything that they had not tithed on, or keeping the laws of purity. You know, you would want to have a Pharisee as your neighbor, because he's not going to steal from you. He's not going to do anything to upset you. He's not going to do anything wrong to you. The Pharisees were, outwardly speaking, were the most upright, substantial citizens that lived in the area. However, they did give Jesus a lot of problems while he was here upon this earth. The majority of the Sanhedrin were Pharisees. The Sanhedrin was sort of like the Supreme Court. The Jewish, they had 73 elders who formed what they called the Sanhedrin. And like I said, it was like what we would call the Supreme Court today. And most of them were Pharisees, very meticulous Jews. So Jesus is going to paint a story about 2 men going into the temple to pray. One of them is a Pharisee, upright, outstanding, follows all the Jewish laws, tries to do everything in the very right way. And then we meet another fella here. It's called the publican. We see him in verse 13. Now, who is a publican? A publican is a tax collector. Now remember, when Jesus walked on the face of this earth, Rome was in charge of the entire known world. The Roman government was in charge, and they taxed everybody, and the money went to Rome in order to finance their armies and their government and all that kind of thing. So a publican was one who collected taxes or customs or tolls. If somebody was passing through an area, he would be the one that would stop. Toll booths and toll roads and paying tolls, that's not anything new. They had it back in Bible days. You were a merchant and you were a trader, and you were going from one area to another area, and you're going to pass through my territory, you're going to pay me. And you're going to make sure that you pay me, because you want to make sure that you get through and go on where you're going. So a publican was a tax collector. Now, what happens is, a lot of times, the tax collector happened to be Jewish. And when the tax collector was Jewish, nobody liked this guy. Okay, keep in mind, here you're a Jew and you're living in Israel. Rome comes and takes over your country as well as all the other countries in the world. So they're the enemies. Boo, Roman government, boo. You know, we have to pay taxes to the Roman government. But here's what happens. The Roman government comes and says, okay, I have this area here. Who would like to be the tax collector for this area? And what they would do is they would bid on becoming a tax collector for a certain area. And the Roman government would come and tell you, look, here's your area, and based on the size of your area and the number of people that lived in your area, this is what we expect you to collect in taxes every year and send to the Roman government. Anything you collect above and beyond that is yours. Wow, what a deal. You're the tax man. You come in there and you're the one who tells them how much tax they have to pay. And so these tax collectors were hated by the Jews. First of all, they were paying taxes, and it wasn't going to their government, it was going to the Roman government. And then, if a Jewish person happened to be a tax collector, that was even worse because they looked upon him like a traitor. What are you doing collecting tax? Well, he did it for the money. You see, you're only required to send so much money from your area into Rome every year for your taxes. But whatever you collected in taxes above and beyond that went in your pockets. So the Jewish people, even though they hated the Roman government, some of them looked at it as an opportunity to make money. Some of them looked at it as a wonderful opportunity to make some money off of their fellow Jews. And so the publicans were hated. They were despised. They were looked on that they were bought by Rome. Okay, well, you sold out to the Roman government just for money. You're doing this job. And so, by the way, Matthew and Levi and Zacchaeus were all publicans. They were tax collectors in the Bible. So get the background of the story now. Jesus is going to be talking about two things, about people who try to make themselves seem what they are not, outwardly looking good, but inwardly having problems. And also, Jesus is giving us a beautiful picture about prayer, how we're supposed to come to God in prayer in the story here. So we got the two main characters. We have these two men. We have the Pharisee, the pillar of the community, a patriot, respected by everybody, follows all the Jewish laws. Nobody has a problem with the Pharisee. And then we have this publican, a reproach, a disgusting traitor, somebody who sold out to the Roman government just to make a bunch of money. So we have these two men, and they're about ready to go into the temple to pray. And Jesus he's using a contrast here. He's contrasting how one person comes to pray and how he tries to make himself look good outwardly, and how another person comes to pray and they're really honest with themselves and honest with God. Jesus condemning the one and approving the other was a staggering assault on Jewish judgment. You see, when Jesus gets down to the end of the story, he says that the publican is the man who went home justified. Now, if you talk to a Jew and you say, I'm going to tell you a story, and in my story, I'm going to talk to you about a Pharisee, and I'm going to talk to you about a publican. Now, right away, the Jewish mind would have his mind already set, okay, the Pharisee's got to be the good guy in the story, because after all, he's a Jew, follows all the laws, tries to do everything right. And the publican, he's that hated tax collector, he's got to be the bad guy in the story. So people had in their minds, already before even Jesus got to the end of the story, who was going to be the hero of the story, because everybody liked the Pharisee. Everybody knew the Pharisee tried to be a religious person, tried to do what's right, but Jesus turned the tables on them. But here, who would possibly choose this publican over the Pharisee? Well, there's nothing to suggest that either is insincere in his self-estimate. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Every line in Jesus' picture is drawn to contrast these two men. Now let's look at the two prayers of these men. Here's two men going into the temple to pray. This upright Jewish citizen, this Pharisee, and this tax collector, publican, okay? So they go into the temple to pray. Look at verse 10 again in Luke chapter 18. Two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. So that's the groundwork of the story. Now, verse 11. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. So here's this Pharisee getting ready to pray, this religious Jewish person, and he stands up in front of the people and he looks up to heaven. He doesn't come humbly to God. He doesn't come and say, our dear Heavenly Father. He doesn't come with, oh, Holy Father, thank you. He comes, he says, God, sort of like, very, very abrupt. He says, God, and then he goes on to tell what a good guy he is. I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. So right away, here's this Pharisee, and he just comes very abruptly to God. God, I'm glad I'm not like these other guys, and especially this publican. What he tries to do is he tries to compare himself with the other people around him. And 5 times in his prayer, he uses the word I. I thank thee that I am not like other men. I thank thee that I am not. In verse 12, he says, I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. I. This Pharisee was trying to make a big show. Jesus is talking about two people coming to the temple to pray. And so far, the Pharisee, who you would think would be the good guy in the story, he's not looking too good right now. He comes to God very boldly, starts his prayer. God! Like he's trying to get God's attention. Okay, God, you need to stop what you're doing. I got something I need to say. That's the frame of mind that he comes to in this prayer. And then 5 times in this prayer, I. All about, he's trying to show God who he is. After all, he's a Pharisee. He follows all the Jewish laws. He's an upright and outstanding citizen. He does everything he possibly can to make sure that he follows all the laws of Moses, and he tries to do everything right. So when he goes to the temple to pray, he's trying to impress all the people around him about who he is and how that he's much better than the other people around him. He says, thank thee that I am not as other men are. He separates himself from that crowd in that temple. He thinks that he is better than those people in that temple, so he kind of distances himself and says, I thank thee that I am not like all these other people here, and especially that publican. So he thanks God for 3 things he doesn't commit. He says, I'm not an extortioner, I'm not unjust, and I'm not an adulterer. So here, this poor Pharisee, he thinks he's praying to God, but what he's doing is he's making a big show of himself. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody pray like that, but it's disgusting to hear somebody try to they're supposed to be praying to God, but you often wonder, are they praying so that the people around them can hear what they're saying? In fact, look what it says in verse 11. It says, the Pharisee stood up and prayed thus with himself. It doesn't say he was praying to God. He was praying with himself. He was trying to make himself. He wanted everybody around him to know who he was. He wanted everybody around him to know what a good guy he was, that he wasn't an extortioner, he wasn't an adulterer. And thank God he wasn't like this publican fellow over here. So here's this Pharisee, and he's praying out loud in the temple, and it's not really even a prayer. He doesn't ask God for anything. He's basically, he tries to compare himself with the other people around him. I remember the story about, I'm trying to think of the name of the preacher that told this story. I think it was George Buderick. He said one time he was traveling on a train up in Switzerland, and he said he was passing through, it was wintertime, but it hadn't snowed. It was supposed to snow that day. And he was passing through on the train. He was looking out the window, and he saw how, in the wintertime, everything's kind of gray and gloomy. Those of you who lived up north, all the leaves are off the tree. But there was these cottages over there, and they had these beautiful white trim on the cottages, around the windows and around the door frames and all that. And he noticed how, compared to everything else that was kind of dreary and gloomy there in the wintertime, how beautiful the white trim on those cottages looked. Well, then when he got to where he was going on the train, did his business, and on the way back it started snowing. As he passed by those same cottages, he looked at those cottages and he thought, wow, how dreary and dingy that trim looks compared to the beautiful, freshly white-driven snow. And so what happens is we like to compare that's what this Pharisee was doing. He was comparing himself to the people around him. You could always find somebody who's in worse shape than you to compare yourself to. And that's not what we're supposed to do. You'd be better off to find somebody who's doing better than you and compare yourself to that person and say, Lord, help me to do better in my life. One of my dearest friends back in Hammond, Indiana, where I grew up, he was a big fellow. He weighed about 400 pounds. He was a bus driver with me. Our church back in Hammond, we owned an old Continental Trailways tour bus. And I was the driver, and he was the driver, and we used to take different groups of people in the church. They were going across country on a trip. We'd take that big old diesel bus on the tour. But he was very self-conscious about his size. I mean, this guy was huge. And we would be walking, he was a friend of mine for decades, and we'd be walking, and he'd see a large person, okay? I'm trying to be nice with my words. And he would always he'd always go to me, Jerry. I say, what, Ed? He said, do I look that bad? And I always would lie to him. I said, oh, no, Ed. I said, you don't look that bad. No. He goes, oh, good, I don't think so. But, and it was funny because really the truth of the matter is he was larger than everybody he saw. But what he was trying to do was to find somebody that he could compare himself to who was worse than him. He never came to me and saw a skinny fella and said, hey, Jerry, how do I look? He never did that because he knew the answer to that question. But he was always looking for somebody that he could compare himself to who was a little bit larger than him so that it would make him feel better. And that's what this Pharisee was doing here at this church. He went to the temple to pray, and instead of praying and being honest with God, he says, I thank thee that I am not as these other people are. Well, he's trying to make himself look good by comparing himself to people who he thinks are in worse shape than what he is. He says, I fast twice in the week. The Jews were only required to fast one day a year, and that was on the Day of Atonement. That was all they were required to fast. Now, God encouraged them to fast whenever they want, but he tries to impress God of how wonderful a person he is, that he doesn't just fast once a year on the Day of Atonement. He fasts twice in the week. And he says, I give tithes of all that I possess. The Jews were only required to give the tithes of their increase, the yield of their cattle and of their field. So here, this guy, he's trying to impress everybody about who he is, what he does, how much better he is than everybody else. Now comes the publican in the story. Verse 13. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now here's this publican. The fact that he was even in the temple showed how humble he was. These publicans were not welcome. People didn't like them. They looked on him as Jewish traitors. You're a tax collector. You're supposed to be a Jew. You're supposed to be loyal to the Jewish people. And here you sold out to the Roman government, and now you're a tax collector. They didn't like to meet him in the market. They surely didn't want them to come to their house because they knew when they came knocking on the door, they were wanting to get some tax money out of them. But they dead sure were not welcome in the temple because they were looked upon as Jewish traitors. So the fact that this publican would even make his way to the temple showed that he didn't care what people thought about him. He didn't care that he was despised. All he knew was that he needed to get to God and he needed to pray. And so he comes in a completely different manner to the temple. Jesus is painting the picture of the humility of this publican. In verse 13 it says, and the publican standing afar off. In other words, here's the crowd of people in the temple, and the publican walks in the door. He doesn't walk into the middle of the crowd. If this was the temple and the publican would walk in that back door, he'd probably try to find a seat somewhere way in the back row, or he'd go up in the balcony where people wouldn't see him. Because he knew the people didn't like him, but he was humble. Now, saw the Pharisee? Pharisee comes in the temple, he stood up with himself and he's like, oh, God, I thank thee, I'm not like all these other people. No. The publican didn't do that. The publican walked in the temple, and the Bible says the publican standing afar off. Both of these men separated themselves from the crowd in that temple that day. The Pharisee separated himself from the crowd by trying to make himself look better than all the people in the temple. The publican separated himself from the crowd because he felt like that he was the worst person in that building, and that everybody else in that temple was better than him. So see, both of these men separated themselves from the crowd, but in a very different way. The Pharisee, in a very haughty way, thought he was better than everybody, and the poor publican separated himself because he didn't even feel like he deserved to be there, but he wanted to be there. And that just shows the thing. Standing afar off, the Bible says, the publican standing afar would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven. Now what did the Pharisee do? He walked in the temple and he said, God! So everybody, I thank thee. He's trying to make a big show of this thing. And this poor publican, he walks in the temple, he goes off into a corner, and he didn't even want to look up into heaven because he knew that he was a sinner. He knew that he needed God's mercy. He knew that he needed God to help him with his problems. And he was so humble that he stood away from the people, part of that being ashamed, part of that being that he wasn't there for the people. He was there to communicate with God. And when it came time for him to pray, the Bible says he wouldn't even so much as lift up his eyes unto heaven. The Bible says there, but he smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Boy, two completely different prayers, aren't they? Two completely different attitudes of these men coming into the temple. The one coming in the temple wanting to make a big show. wanting everybody to know who he is and how good he is and all the good stuff that he does and how that he's better than everybody else in the temple. And the other guy comes in the temple and says, man, I don't even deserve to be here. I need to pray, but I don't even want to look up to God in heaven. I'm going to bow my head. And he smote upon his breast and he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. You see, the Pharisee thought about everybody else in the building because he was trying to make a show. The publican, he could care less who was in that building. All he was concerned about was himself because he knew that he needed to get a hold of God. He didn't care what other people thought. He knew he was a hated person. But he didn't go to the temple for people to pass judgment on him. He went to the temple that day to pray, and he wanted to get a hold of God. So he didn't care about those other people. The Pharisee, he wanted everybody to know he was there. The publican, he wanted to hide off in the dark corner somewhere. The Pharisee felt no need. You notice in his prayer, he does not ask God for anything. All he says is, God, I thank thee, I'm not as other men, extortioners, unjust, and adulterers, even as I fast twice in a week, give a tithe that I possess. Well, what did you ask God for, Mr. Pharisee? You didn't ask God for anything. You didn't come to God and ask him to help you. You didn't come to God and ask him to forgive you. You didn't come to God and ask him to bless you or bless your family. You just came in there to brag on yourself. But when the publican came in here, all he did was ask God for something. He came in that building, off in some dark corner somewhere, that's why I picture it in my mind, and he smote his breast and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He didn't try to pass off on to God what kind of a person he was. He knew what he was, and he knew God knew what he was. All he wanted to do was come clean with God in this prayer and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The publican felt only need. He wanted to come in there. He needed to get a hold of God. The Pharisee came and appealed to himself for justice. He tried to show God how good he was, how that his good deeds and all the good things that he is and all the good things that he did was the justice that God needed in order for him to be even in that temple that day. But the publican, in a 7-word prayer, God, be merciful to me, a sinner, he realized his condition. He realized that he was somebody who just needed to get a hold of God. I don't care what people around me are looking or saying. I don't care. I know these people probably don't even want me to be here, but I need to get a hold of God. And also, he understood his guilt and asked for mercy. This parable teaches the peril of religion. You know, there's a lot of people who are religious, but they're not right with God. There's a lot of people who will tell you, I go to church every Sunday, but they don't tithe. They don't support worldwide missions. They don't do anything. They don't lift a single finger in order to try to get somebody else saved or try to get the gospel to somebody else. Oh, they're religious. If you go to their home on Sunday morning, they won't be there. They'll be down at the church somewhere. But there's nothing inside. Outwardly, they look like they're good people. Outwardly, they look like, they're doing all the right things. And so Jesus is trying to show us, when he told this parable about the publican and the Pharisee, he knew that the Jewish people were already going to, in their minds, they're going to have a prejudice. They were going to side with the Pharisee. After all, he's a good Jew, follows all the laws. And that they were going to look at this publican and push him off to the shelf. And look what happens. After this publican prays and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner, Jesus says in verse 14, he says, I tell you. Jesus wants to make sure it was very clear to everybody who heard this story what his assessment of this thing is. He says, I tell you that this man, talking about that publican, that hated tax collector who came into the temple and hid off in the corner somewhere, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For every one that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. What Jesus is saying is contrary to popular opinion, contrary to prejudiced conclusions, I'm here to tell you that this publican was the one who came into the temple the right way that day, because those who exalt themselves are going to be abased. You're going to make big of yourself, somebody's going to knock you down, and it probably is going to be the Lord. But if you're going to be humble and honest and come before God with a clean heart and say, God, be merciful to me, a sinner, then you're going to be exalted. God's going to look at you as somebody who is being honest with him. You know, we can't pull anything over on God. But the way human nature is we look on the outside, but God looks on the heart. Look at 1 Samuel, or you can turn there if you want, or I'll just tell you in 1 Samuel in the Old Testament, chapter 16. 1 Samuel 16. The first king of Israel has been removed from the throne. Now it's time for a new king. And God comes to the prophet, Samuel. He says, go to Jesse's house. One of his boys is going to be the next king of Israel. So Samuel the prophet goes to Jesse's house, and he says to Jesse, he says, God told me that one of your boys is going to be the next king of Israel. I need to meet the boys. And in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 6, it came to pass when they were come that he looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. What happened was Eliab was a great big tall fellow, handsome, good looking. And so Eliab was the first one of the sons that comes through, and Samuel said to himself, oop, hey, this guy has got to be the one. This guy is, and look at verse 7. But the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks upon the heart. You see, we tend to judge things by the way we see. These Jewish people hearing Jesus tell this story about two men going to the temple to pray, they're going to think in their minds that the Pharisee has got to be the hero of the story. He's got to be. He's a great fella, follows all the laws. And there's no way that this hated tax collector publican. But God says to Samuel the prophet, and he's telling these people through this parable in the same way in the book of Luke, he says, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. Outwardly, the Pharisee was the better of the two men. Outwardly, he was the one who appeared to be the one who was trying to do the right thing, following all the Jewish laws. But inwardly, the publican had the right heart's attitude. He had the right attitude towards prayer. He had the right attitude about himself. When he came to God, he wasn't trying to impress God or anybody else in that building, because all he wanted to do was come clean with God and say, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. You know, I've often heard this say, church is a spiritual hospital. It's not a spiritual museum. We don't come to church on Sunday just to show everybody how good we are. We come to church because we're all sinners and we need God to help us in our lives. We need to stop and take one day a week, as God has told us in his Bible, and we need to set aside this day. And when we come to church, oh yeah, we're going to try to put the best clothes we can on. We're going to try to, dress up and come to church and all that kind of thing. But the bottom line is that we come as a spiritual hospital to church. We need God to help us. We need strength to go through another week. We don't need to come in here and some people treat church like as a spiritual museum, to tell everybody, oh, I read 68 chapters in my Bible this week, or well, I prayed 17 hours on my knees this week. No, you don't come to church as a spiritual museum. We come to the church as a spiritual hospital. We all need God's help. We all need. And so this story here in the parable of the publican and the Pharisee, what Jesus is saying is, don't look on the outward appearance at other people. That's one of the lessons that we learn in here. And number two is, when you come to pray, come clean with God. You and I are not going to impress God. Do you know that? God knows us. He knows our thoughts of our hearts. He knows the thoughts and intents of our hearts. He knows what we've done and what we're going to do. But a lot of times we come to God and we come to prayer, we come to church, especially when we come to prayer. Don't do like that Pharisee. Don't come to God, with everything on the outside being perfect. I dressed up this morning to come to church. I put on a suit, put on a shirt and tie, cleaned my shoes off, but I don't come to God that way. I come to God because God knows what's on the inside. Outwardly, you and I might have everything good and ready to go. Outwardly, we might have the saying goes, all of our ducks in a row. But the truth of the matter is, when we come to prayer, we can look good on the outside, but God looks on the inside. We can have everything looking good on the outside. We can come to church. And we can have the biggest Bible that we own under our arms. And we can pull up in the parking lot and make sure that everybody sees that we showed up to church today. And on the outside, everything looks good. But when you come to pray, don't try to pull that stuff on God, because God knows what we look like on the inside. God knows all of the sins we've ever committed. God knows the thoughts that we had this week. God knows the little lies that we told this week to keep ourselves out of trouble. God knows everything. So one of the biggest lessons in this parable in Luke chapter 18 was not only to teach us not to how to pray to God, but also don't prejudge people from what you can see on the outside. Because God looks on the, just like he told Samuel, he says, look not on his countenance, when he's talking about that tall boy that might have been the king. Look not on his countenance, for man looks on the outward appearance. Okay? Man looks on the outward appearance. Everything looks good on the outside. You're ready to go. Everything's fine. But God looks on the heart, and he knows what's inside. When Jesus talked to the scribes and the Pharisees, he called them one time, he said, you whited sepulchres full of dead men's bones. A sepulcher was a burying place. And they would go, and I lived 11 years in New Orleans, and we used to take the people on the cemetery tours. All the cemeteries in New Orleans are above ground. And they were all, especially in the older cemeteries, they were marble and they were limestone sarcophagus. And once a year on All Saints' Day, they would go to the cemeteries with bleach and water, and they would whitewash the tombs. And the tombs would look beautiful on the outside. Some of them looked like little palaces. They had columns on the front and all that kind of thing. And Jesus said to the Pharisees, he said, you're just like those, you're like a whited sepulcher, a tombstone that's been all cleaned and polished. Looks good on the outside. He said, but inside you're full of dead men's bones. And God said, that's the way you come to me in prayer. Don't come to me like that Pharisee. Don't try to impress God what you have done. Well, I've been a member of this church for 75 years. I've given so much money to this church. I've come to this, I haven't missed a service. I have this big pin on my jacket that says I haven't missed Sunday school in 15 years. That kind of stuff doesn't impress God. What impresses God is when we come to God and say, you know what, Lord? I sure do need your help. I sure need you to forgive my sin. I need you to bless me this week. Watch over me. Watch over my family. I don't deserve your help, Lord. That's what we call to God for mercy. That's what he said. When that sinner prayed, he said, he smote his breast, he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Mercy is for you and I not to get what we deserve. You go to court, you got a speeding ticket, and you know you were speeding, you go before the judge, and you say, Judge, please be merciful. What are you asking? You say, I know I deserve to have this ticket, but please be merciful. Don't give me what I deserve. That's mercy. And that's what that sinner was asking God for. Now, grace is God giving to us what we don't deserve. God is blessing us in such a wonderful way. Well, we don't deserve to be blessed. God doesn't owe us anything. So we are partakers of God's grace. Grace is God giving to me something that I don't deserve. God's been good to me. He's given me a good family. You might say, God's given me health, or God's given my children health, or I still have a job, and I have a roof over my head, and I have food to eat. God, you've been so gracious unto me. That's grace. Mercy. God, please be merciful to me. Don't give me what I deserve. If I was God and somebody did things to me like I do to God, I would be angry, and I would want to punish them. But God, please be merciful to me. Lord, I'm a human being. I have problems. I have failures. And I'm going to confess them to you, and I'm going to tell you straight out exactly what my problems are. So this beautiful story in Luke 18 teaches us two things. When you come to God, don't try to cover up what's on the inside. God can look on the inside, and he knows what's going on the inside. And the second thing is, when we look at other people, don't look on the outside and try to pass judgments, because you don't know what's on the outside. That publican looked dirty outwardly. He's a stinking tax collector. He's a traitor to the Jews. He sided up with the Roman government. Outwardly, this guy looks bad. But inwardly, he had it all together. He came to that temple and he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Two great lessons here in Luke chapter 18 on prayer and also on how we're not supposed to judge other people, how they look on the outside.